Okay, we're happy to give it a minute. And Brian, the camera's on, and okay. Okay, great. Thank you, Brian. All right, we'll get started. Good morning. I'm Nestor Davidson, chair of the New York City Rent Guidelines Board. I'd like to welcome you to this meeting of the board. This is the 6th meeting in a series of public meetings and hearings to determine lease adjustments for rent stabilized housing units in New York City with leases commencing on or being renewed on or after October 1st, 2024, and on or before September 30th, 2025. I'll now take roll call. Please respond if present. Doug Apple. Here. Hennessy Aquino. Christina DeRose. Rob Ehrlich. Present. Arpit Gupta. Alex Schwartz. Present. Christina Smith. Present. Adon Soltran. Present. Nestor Davidson. I'm present. Let the record show that we have a quorum. The next 4 meetings of the board will be public hearings to comment on the proposed guidelines. They will be held on the following dates and times. May 30th at the Jamaica Performing Arts Center, 15301 Jamaica Avenue in Queens. June 3rd, Hostos Community College, 450 Grand Concourse in the Bronx. June 5th, Medgar Evers College, 1650 Bedford Avenue, first floor in Brooklyn. And June 11th, Adler Hall, New York Society for Ethical Culture, 2 West 64th Street in Manhattan. And all of our hearings will be from 5 p.m. until 8 p.m. Anyone who wants to comment on the proposed rule at a public hearing must sign up to speak. People wishing to speak at the public hearing can pre-register in advance. You can pre-register online through our website, nyc.gov/RGB, or you can sign up to speak by calling 212-669-7480 from 9 a.m. until 5 p.m. Monday through Friday. You can also register to speak the day of the hearing at the hearing location, again from 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. All of our public hearings will be live streamed via YouTube, and Spanish interpretation will be provided at each hearing. If you are unable to attend our hearings, you can submit written, audio, and/or video comments prior to the hearing for the board members to review through June 11th. Instructions on how to submit these comments are available on the board's website, which again is nyc.gov/RGB, by email at ask@rgb.nyc.gov, or by calling the RGB again at 212-669-7480. The proposed rental adjustments are posted on our website, nyc.gov/RGB, and on the NYC Rules website at http://rules.cityofnewyork, all one word, .us. The final vote on guidelines will take place on June 17th, starting at 7 p.m. in the Assembly Hall at Hunter College, East 69th Street between Park and Lexington Avenues. If you are interested in receiving email updates about upcoming RGB meetings and hearings, please go to our homepage and click on RGB email updates under quick links. Today, staff will present the 2024 Housing Supply Report, changes to the rent stabilized housing stock in New York City in 2023 report, and the 2024 hotel report. Copies of these reports are in your meeting folder. There are copies of these reports here today, and they will be made available on our website after the meeting. Just click Research on our homepage to download these reports. Any comments or questions before we begin? Please.
Thank you. A note on the public hearings. So the board is in possession of a letter and a statement from many of the Northern Manhattan elected officials. We received it on May 13, 2024. It was signed by Carmen de la Rosa, Sean Abreu, Congressman Espaillat, Senator Jackson, Assemblymember Manny de los Santos, and Assemblymember Taylor. And it was an additional request for an Uptown Manhattan hearing because of the fact that many of their constituents uptown live in rent-stabilized housing and will be not only drastically impacted this, but by number, their constituents will be widely impacted by our decision-making. So I I know I brought it up a few times on the record previously, the need for an additional hearing. I realize that at this point in the process, I don't think it's appropriate to call for a formal vote. Excuse me. That being said, I do think that not only the Uptown constituents in Washington Heights, Harlem, East Harlem, et cetera, are entitled to an answer. And so I think that it is important to be explicit and specific in letting them know whether or not there will be a hearing. And moving forward, I do think for the next cycle that I will be pushing for an additional hearing. And if it comes to having to make a formal vote, I will do such in the following season.
Thank you, Don, and I appreciate it, and we will respond as we have to earlier requests. Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Thank you. Let me now introduce Danielle Berger, our co-research director, who will be presenting the 2024 Housing Supply Report.
Good morning. The Rent Stabilization Law requires the Rent Guidelines Board to consider the overall supply of housing accommodations and overall vacancy rates. Therefore, our research staff produces an annual housing supply report, which highlights year-to-year changes and trends in the supply of residential housing in New York City, with a focus on findings from the 2023 Housing and Vacancy Survey, new construction and demolition data, conversions and subdivisions, cooperative and condominium activity, housing rehabilitation, and government housing programs and funding. The major findings of this year's housing supply report are 16,348 building permits were issued in 2023 for housing units, a decrease of 76.2%, an increase of 8.0% in units in newly constructed buildings, a total of 27,971 units. City-sponsored efforts during 2023 will add or preserve 27,911 housing units to the residential stock, 51% of which were new construction and 49% of which are preservation projects, and an increase in total units of 80.3% over the prior year. Permits for demolitions of both residential and commercial buildings decreased by 46.3% to 964 structures in 2023. And for newly certified units utilizing tax incentives, there was a 56.2% increase in the number of 421A units to 21,020 units, but a decrease of 26.8% in J51 units to 10,903 units. In addition, as of 2023, 9.2% of all rental housing is considered overcrowded. The citywide rental vacancy rate was 1.41% in 2023, and New York City has a total of 3,705,000 housing units, the largest housing stock since the first HVS was conducted in 1965. Preliminary findings from the 2023 Housing and Vacancy Survey, the periodic survey of the city's housing stock, were released to the public in February of this year. New York City is unique in that a significant share of its housing is renter-occupied. The HVS reports that more than 2/3 of the city's available housing stock is renter-occupied, compared to 35% for the nation as a whole. New York City has almost 2.4 million rental units, and 42% of those are rent stabilized. Vacancy rates also vary by rent regulation status. The HVS found the overall rental vacancy rate was 1.41% in 2023, Rent-stabilized units had a lower vacancy rate than the overall rental units at 0.98%, while market rentals were vacant at a 1.84% rate. The HVS also reports on overcrowding rates. The overall rental overcrowding rate was 9.2% in 2023. Rent-stabilized units were overcrowded at a rate of 13.1%, while market rentals were overcrowded at a 6.7% rate. As this pie chart illustrates, as of 2023, the most recent data via the Housing and Vacancy Survey, about 2/3 of New York City's occupied housing stock are renter units. The largest share is private, non-regulated rentals, 48%, followed by rent-stabilized, 42%, public housing, 7%, other regulated units at 2%, and rent-controlled units at 1%. Examining the number of building permits issued annually helps to determine the amount of new housing planned each year. Permit approvals for new housing units in 2023 decreased by 76.2% to 16,348, following a 192.7% increase in the prior year, precipitated by the expiration of the 421A program. In 2023, permits fell in every borough, including Brooklyn, down 83.2% to 5,285 units. Manhattan, down 83.2% to 2,025 units. Queens, down 71.4% to 3,813 units. The Bronx, down 56.1% to 4,771 units. And Staten Island, down 45.1% to 454 units. The number of buildings newly permitted fell by 34.0% in 2023, from 1,393 in 2022 to 920 in 2023. The average size of buildings newly permitted fell from 49.3% units in 2022 to 17.8 units in 2023, a 64.0% decline. This graph illustrates that 16,348 residential building permits were issued during 2023, a decrease of 76.2%, following an increase of 192.7% in 2022 due to the impending expiration of the 421A program. While the city overall had a 76.2% decrease in permits to 16,348 citywide, this map shows the number of permits by borough in 2023 and the change from 2022. As the map illustrates, the largest proportional decreases were in Brooklyn and Manhattan, and the largest share of permits was in Brooklyn. Permit data can also be analyzed more deeply by looking at the reported size of the buildings receiving permits. In 2023, a total of 920 buildings received permits, containing a total of 16,348 units of housing. Citywide, 22.5% of these buildings were single-family, 32.4% were two-family, 9.1% were 3 or 4 family structures, and 36.0% were buildings with 5 or more units. As the graph illustrates, the majority of buildings in Manhattan, Brooklyn, and the Bronx were 5 family or greater, while in Staten Island, virtually all buildings were either 1 or 2 family. Building size was more evenly distributed in Queens. Another way of measuring the level of housing creation is to look at the number of Class A housing units actually completed in new buildings in a given year, which in 2023 increased. In 2023, there were 27,971 units in new buildings completed citywide, an 8.0% increase over the prior year. By borough, completions were up 97.1% in the Bronx to 9,842 units, up 12.2% in Brooklyn to 9,262 units, up 2.6% in Staten Island to 475 units, down 36.5% in Queens to 4,646 units, and down 23.5% in Manhattan to 3,746 units. There was also a net gain of 2,790 Class A residential units via alterations, but a loss of 1,023 units of Class A residential housing through demolitions. This graph illustrates the number of units in newly completed buildings in each year from 2014 to 2023, which in 2023 increased. In 2023, an estimated 27,971 housing units in new buildings were completed, an 8.0% increase from 2022. Moving on to city-sponsored construction, new housing is also created by various programs sponsored by the city's Department of Housing Preservation and Development and the Housing Development Corporation. These agencies reported 27,911 housing starts in 2023, an increase of 80.3%, and 51% of which were new construction and 49% preservations. The location of the units by borough are Brooklyn with 37.2%, Bronx 32.3%, Manhattan 18.1%, Queens 12.2%, and Staten Island 0.2%. By affordability level, 20.6% of the units are aimed at extremely low-income households, 21.1% at very low-income households, 31.9% at low-income households, 7.9% at moderate-income households, and 18.5% at middle or higher-income households. The 421A program was designed to encourage new construction of multifamily housing. Owners are exempt from paying additional real estate taxes on the increased value of the property due to the new construction. Depending on the iteration of the program, which over its 50-year history has periodically expired and then been renewed by the New York State Legislature, exemptions last for 10 to 35 years, and rental properties must abide by all rent regulations during benefits. The current iteration of the 421A program expired on June 15, 2022, and was not renewed by the New York State Legislature. For the second consecutive year, the number of units newly receiving final certificates of eligibility increased, rising 56.2%. A total of 21,020 units were newly issued final 421A exemptions in 2023, with 40.8% in Brooklyn, 27.3% in Queens, 16.8% in the Bronx, and 15.1% in Manhattan. For the third consecutive year, there were no units in Staten Island. Final certificates of eligibility increased in all boroughs except Staten Island during 2023, increasing 173.8% in Queens, 68.8% in Manhattan, 28.6% in Brooklyn, and 25.8% in the Bronx. As previously noted, for the third consecutive year, there were no newly certified 421A units in Staten Island. As you can see in this graph, the number of apartment units newly receiving final certification of 421A benefits in 2023 increased for the second consecutive year by 56.2%. More than 2/3 of these units are in Brooklyn and Queens. Another tax abatement and exemption program previously available to owners has been the J51 program. J51 was designed to encourage rehabilitation of residential units. As with the 421A program, J51 benefits were available to both rental as well as owner-occupied units. The J51 program expired for all work completed after June 29, 2022, but the program is still in the process of certifying abatements and exemptions for work completed prior to this date. Eligible activities included MCIs, moderate or substantial rehabilitation, and conversion from non-residential use if substantial government assistance is provided. 10,903 units were newly approved for benefits in 2023, a 26.8% decrease from 2022. By borough, there was a decrease of 79.5% in Manhattan, 56.4% in Queens, and 19.9% in the Bronx. However, there was an increase of 80.8% in Brooklyn and no change in Staten Island. Of the newly approved units, 58.9% of them were rentals. This chart shows the fluctuation in the number of housing units newly receiving J51 benefits since 2001. In 2023, 10,903 units newly received J51 benefits, a decrease of 26.8% from the previous year. This is the third smallest number of units since at least 1988, the first year for which data is available. Not shown here, the decrease in the number of rental units, 9.6%, was less than that of owner units, 42.5%. The New York City Department of Buildings tracks the number of structures applying for demolition permits each year, which decreased in 2023 by 46.3% to 964 residential and commercial structures. By borough, Brooklyn had a 35.4% share of permits, a decline of 48.6%. Queens had a 28.4% share of permits, a decline of 46.0%. The Bronx had a 16.0% share of demolition permits, a decline of 45.2%. Manhattan had a 10.3% share of demolitions, a decline of 32.7%. And Staten Island accounted for a 10.0% share of permits, a decline of 51.5%. The New York City Department of City Planning also tracks demolitions of buildings containing Class A residential units of housing. Per that agency, demolition permits for buildings containing Class A residential units of housing decreased 47.2%, with the number of units in these buildings decreasing 31.4%. Citywide, a total of 389 Class A buildings with a total of 1,023 units of Class A housing applied for demolition permits in 2023. So in conclusion, the number of building permits decreased in 2023 following a large increase in 2022. However, units in newly completed buildings increased and more units were certified with 421A tax incentives, in addition to more starts sponsored by the city, but less units rehabilitated with J51 tax incentives. And demolition permits for both residential and commercial buildings decreased. And data from the 2023 HVS shows that the rental vacancy rate is 1.41% and 9.2% of rental housing is overcrowded. Thank you, and if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Danielle. Questions? Well, I'll ask one just to get us started quickly. Appreciate the explanation on the shift. Wow, you can't see this on video, but there's quite a storm outside. In terms of 421A from last year, or 2022 to 2023, do you have a sense of what's driving the shift in J51, or what drove that? Because the trend seems to follow some pretty clear patterns, and I'm just curious if you have a sense of what has driven that kind of sequencing.
Well, it's just going to keep going down because the program at this moment is not in place. There is some talk about reauthorizing it with some changes. I think there were some changes previous to this that I don't know off the top of my head what they were that may have impacted things, and also, some changes I think in the HSTPA in terms of being able to get, recoup the money for some of those things that were being combined with the J51.
Thank you. Other questions? Alex, can you turn your mic on? Sorry.
Thanks, Danielle. Regarding the city-funded starts, I think it's important to note that most of the preservation starts really don't add to the housing stock at all. In some cases, they involve renovations. In some cases, it's just renewal of subsidy. So I think it's important to make that point. And also, is it possible to show over time the city-funded new construction starts alone?
Yeah, you just want the number of starts
Yeah, I think
for new
just
construction?
to show that in the
Construction.
new construction, city-funded starts. I just think in terms of the context of the city housing supply, that's significant because it's really different from preservation starts, which are obviously very important, but really don't affect the total supply.
Sure.
Thank you. Other questions? Again, thank you, Danielle. Let me now introduce Brian Hoberman, RGB Co-Research Director, to present the changes report. And Brian, you might need to speak up a little bit given the raging storm outside our window.
Do my best. Hey, good morning. Rent regulation has been a fixture in New York City's housing market for over 8 decades, although the laws that govern rent-regulated housing have been substantially changed and modified over time. In 2019, for instance, the passage of the HSTPA eliminated some of the ways that apartments could be deregulated. In addition to legislative changes, the existing laws allow for dynamic changes in the regulatory status of a significant portion of the rent-regulated housing stock in any given year. Units enter, exit, or change status within the regulatory system. This report is our annual update of changes to the rent-stabilized housing stock in the city. These totals do not represent every unit that has been added or subtracted from the stabilized stock, but rather those that have been recorded or registered by various city and state agencies. They represent a floor or a minimum count of the actual number of newly regulated and deregulated units in these years. Since newly constructed or substantially rehabilitated units are exempt from rent stabilization, increases to the regulated housing stock are often a result of owners placing these new units under rent stabilization in exchange for tax benefits. Programs and events that lead to the addition of stabilized units include the following: the Section 421A tax exemption program, the J51 property tax exemption abatement program, Articles 11, 14, and 15 of the private housing finance law programs, Mitchell-Lama buyouts, lofts converted to rent-stabilized units, rent-controlled apartments converting to rent stabilization, as well as other types of additions. Tax exemption and abatement programs have a sizable impact on the inventory of stabilized housing. In 2023, an estimated total of 5,194 units were added to the rent-stabilized stock through the 421A program, a 38% increase from the prior year. Largest proportion of units were in the Bronx, with 49%, followed by Brooklyn with 27%, Queens with 15%, and Manhattan with 9%. In addition, there were 9 units on Staten Island. According to HCR, the median legal rent of currently registered rent-stabilized apartments receiving 421A tax abatements in 2023 was $3,043, an 8% decline from the prior year. And through the J51 program, 45 units were added to the rent-stabilized stock in 2023, down from 119 added in the prior year. Other additions to the rent-stabilized housing stock in 2023 include 183 units that were decontrolled and became stabilized, down 19% from the prior year. 14 loft units entered the rent stabilization system in 2023, up from 3 added the prior year. There were no Mitchell-Lama rental units that became rent stabilized in 2023, the same as the prior year. Finally, Articles 11, 14, and 15 tax incentive programs added 88 units in 2023, down from 273 in the prior year. Summing up all of the additions, 5,524 additions to the rent-stabilized housing stock in 2023 represent a 26% increase from the prior year. Of these initially registered rent-stabilized apartments, the median legal registered rent was $3,059, a 28% increase from the prior year. Examining the number of stabilized units added by borough, the Bronx saw almost half of the additions with 48%, followed by Brooklyn with 27%, Queens with 16%, and Manhattan with 9%. There were an additional 9 units on Staten Island. Now we'll move on to the subtraction of units from rent stabilization. Deregulation of stabilized units occur because of statutory requirements or because of changes to residential dwellings. Events and programs that have led to the removal of stabilized units include co-op condo conversions, expiration of 421A and J51 benefits, substantial rehabilitation, conversion to commercial or professional status, as well as other types of losses. In 2023, apartments were removed from the stabilized housing stock due to co-op condo status conversions, which include both newly converted units as well as stabilized tenants vacating apartments in previously converted buildings. And that totaled 653 units in 2023, up 23% from the prior year. Expiration of 421A benefits resulted in the removal of 3,548 units from the stabilization system in 2023, double the number of the prior year, which was 1,763 units. Expiration of J51 benefits in 2023 resulted in the removal of 231 units, a 37% decline from the prior year. 554 units were removed from stabilization through substantial rehabilitation, 72% more than the 322 units removed in the prior year, and 8 units were converted to non-residential use, up from 3 in the prior year. HCR annual registration data shows that 4,700 units were removed from the stabilized housing stock in 2023 due to other reasons, an 18% increase over the prior year. Since 2018, the number of units removed in this other category has increased 1,311%, when just 333 units were removed that year. A majority of units that fall into the other category occur if owners register units as permanently exempt when certain 421A units, upon vacancy, reach the market rate threshold exemption, the MRTE, which in 2023 was $2,952. Additional reasons for deregulation contained in the other category include if 2 or more units had been merged into one larger unit, or if a building was condemned or demolished. Note, however, that combining 2 or more apartments can no longer lead to deregulation in 2024 after new legislation was enacted at the end of last year. Summing up the subtractions, at least 9,694 units left rent stabilization in 2023, a 39% increase from the prior year. Almost half the subtractions were in Manhattan, with 47%. The second largest loss was in Brooklyn, with 28%, followed by Queens with 19%, the Bronx with 6%, and Staten Island with 1%. This table, which is also in the report, if you have trouble reading it, shows the total number of additions and subtractions from all the programs in 2023. It includes the 5,524 additions to the stabilized stock and the 9,694 units removed from rent stabilization. The difference between the two results in an estimated net decrease of 4,170 units from the stabilized housing stock last year. As shown in the previous slide, the study found an estimated net loss of 4,170 units in 2023. The great majority of additions to the stabilized stock were the result of the 421A tax incentive program expirations or additions, representing 94% of the additions. Meanwhile, the largest source of measured subtractions from the rent stabilized housing stock in 2023 fell into the other category, which accounted for 48% of the decrease. The next largest source of subtractions was from the 421A program expiration, accounting for 37%. This graph shows the estimated annual change in the total number of rent-stabilized units since 2003, when the RGB first examined this data. While this most recent year saw a net decrease of 4,170 units, cumulatively since 2003, there has been a net decrease of at least 110,434 rent-stabilized units over the last 21 years. Summing up the changes since 1994, the first year for which we have data, a total of at least 184,998 units have been added to the rent stabilization system, while a minimum of 338,408 rent stabilized units have been deregulated. for an estimated net loss of at least 153,410 rent-stabilized units over the last 30 years. Thank you. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to take them.
Thank you, Brian. Questions? Arpit?
So I just wanted to confirm I had the counts right for how many units are entering market rate housing every year. So just ballparking it, it seems like before HSTPA, there were roughly 20,000 new constructions and 10,000 conversions of rent stabilized units into market rate housing. Since HSTPA, there's been, only a few thousand units added. So the effect of HSTPA then is that the market rate housing stock is growing by, give or take 10,000 units less a year, and those units are staying in rent stabilization.
Yeah, I'd have to take a look. I'm not sure if I can
Just like ballpark, I just wanted to.
ballpark. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Curious, when you look at the additions to the stabilized housing stock, none of the categories refer to the federal low-income housing tax credit. My understanding is virtually all of those units are rent stabilized, and it's a substantial number. And I'm just curious, unless it overlaps with some of the tax exemptions, do you know why that is, that those figures aren't included?
Well, this is data that we receive from DHCR, so if
Right.
they don't break it out that way, so I can't say for sure whether or not they're
Because
in
it's a
the data.
substantial sum. It's well over 100,000
Yeah.
units.
If they're not registering with HCR, then it wouldn't show up in our data, so that's a possibility.
Okay, but I think anyway, I think it's something worth looking into.
It's something they should be registering if it is rent stabilized.
Yeah, I think last year, I remember asking almost exactly the same question. And I think I would concur with Alex. Almost every government financed is required to register and be rent stabilized. And they wouldn't be a 421A. They'd be Article 11 or some other tax abatement.
Yeah, we asked them for all the additions, so I'm not sure why it wouldn't show up if it's
I wonder
registered.
if it's like a data question with HPD maybe about how that works?
I mean, there's other,
It's
yeah.
vexing, because I feel like.
I mean, there are other sources of additions that for years we haven't been able to obtain, like 420C was a program that we stopped collecting years ago.
But a LIHTC project just
That-
alone wouldn't necessarily be rent stabilized, right? It needs to have some other trigger.
Potentially,
I think
Right.
though,
most end up being.
I think almost
because
all
of
of them
other
are.
subsidies.
Yes.
Sorry, go ahead,
Yes.
Alex.
Yeah, my understanding is virtually every one of them is. But I think it's worth, also it has effect on like the average rents, because it's presumably the rents or the rent for the LIHTC properties will be lower than, let's say, 421A. But it's just curious that that category isn't covered. And I know this is something probably you should have noticed over the years, but I think it's worth finding out why it's not included in this data, if that's possible.
Okay, I'll look into that. I mean, I do,
Sir.
I'm sorry, just to refer to what I said, 420C, which is projects that were developed in conjunction with the low-income housing tax credit program. And that's footnote 5, and note 5, that we couldn't collect the data, and this note goes back several years, so, but I'll look into it again.
Okay. All right. Other comments or questions? All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Finally, let me introduce Danielle Berger again to present the 2024 hotel report.
Sorry, if I could just make a quick comment about the last question. I know it's not my report, but
Please.
HCR is reporting only units in a particular year that are newly rent stabilized. So if it's not a new building, it could have already been rent stabilized. And those 100,000 units that you refer to were not all in a single year. It was over, a large period of time. So it may be, I can't say if it is or it isn't, but if they were already rent stabilized, it's not going to be counted as a newly rent stabilized unit.
And I will say this, with HCR, we identify the unit on how they register it being added. So if that option isn't there to check that off, it goes into the other category. So we can't count that until HCR decides to change the registration. So I suspect, since they're getting the subsidy, that they are registering. So I think they're captured in our additions over the last 21 years that we've been doing this. So I think they're in there, it's just not identified, I believe.
Sorry, Danielle. I'll just say one other thing, and Alex, you and I have talked about this. I do think it's interesting and helpful to understand the overlap between rent stabilization and other affordability programs. And so that's a picture of the portfolio that I think we have access to and would be interesting to make part of the kind of supply report at some point, or at least to allude to. Thank you.
The New York City Rent Guidelines Board is charged with setting annual rent adjustments for rent-stabilized units in Class A and Class B hotels, rooming and lodging houses, and single-room occupancy buildings, all referred to generally as hotels. The board has historically used information from the RGB's research reports, including the Price Index of Operating Costs and the Housing Supply Report, to help to determine appropriate hotel guidelines. Periodic memos beginning in 2007 and related to rent levels in rent-stabilized hotel units have also supplemented these reports. The 2024 hotel report is the third annual report that consolidates research related to hotels into a single report. The report includes information on certifications of no harassment for SROs, illegal hotel violations, and the number of hotel units registered with New York State Homes and Community Renewal, HCR, as well as the average and median rents in these units. Data from the hotel portion of the PIOC is also included. In summary, the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development issued 64 certifications of no harassment for single-room occupancy buildings in 2023, a decrease of 30.4% over the prior year. The Mayor's Office of Special Enforcement issued 1,266 violations for illegal hotels in 2023, a 29.7% decrease from 2022. The 2024 Price Index of Operating Costs found an average increase in the cost of operating hotels of 3.3% between April of 2023 and March of 2024. Per an analysis of 2022-2023 HCR registration data, the median legal rent for hotels and rooming houses is $1,068, and the average is $1,130. The median rent received, which is the legal rent except for where there is a preferential rent, for rooming houses and hotels is $910, and the average is $1,011. Per a longitudinal analysis of 2022 and 2023 HCR registration data, the median legal rent rose by 1.8% between 2022 and 2023, and the average legal rent rose by 1.6%. The median rent received fell by 1.2%, and the average rent received rose by 0.9%. SRO owners may convert SRO housing to other uses after obtaining a certification of no harassment from the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development. For the first time in 3 years, the number of CONHs granted by HPD fell by 30.4% to 64 in 2023. This graph illustrates the number of certifications of no harassment granted by HPD for SROs from 2016 through 2023. Certifications ranged from a high of 135 in 2016 to a low of 34 in 2020. As previously noted, certifications fell by 30.4% in 2023 to 64. A series of laws beginning in May of 2011 strengthened the city's ability to crack down on housing being used illegally for transient occupancy, and increase the fines for doing so. In 2023, 1,266 violations were issued by the Mayor's Office of Special Enforcement related to the illegal short-term rental of units, including apartments, private homes, and SROs. In 2023, the total number of violations fell by 29.7%. By borough, there was 456 violations in Brooklyn, 36.0% of the total. 361 violations in Queens, 28.5% of the total. 353 violations in Manhattan, 27.9% of the total. 78 violations in the Bronx, 6.2% of the total. And 18 violations in Staten Island, 1.4% of the total. Between May 2011 and December 2023, approximately 26,000 violations have been issued by OSC as part of its efforts to address illegal short-term rentals. This table summarizes, by borough, the violations issued by the Mayor's Office of Special Enforcement in each year between 2016 and 2023. As noted on the last slide, the number of violations fell 29.7% in 2023 from 1,801 to 1,266. As is the case in most years, the vast majority of violations issued by OSE in 2023 were substantive, a total of 1,210 violations, or 95.6% of all violations. This slide presents data from the hotel portion of the 2024 Price Index of Operating Costs report. Per the 2024 PIOC, the hotel price index for all hotels that contain rent-stabilized units increased 3.3% this year, compared to an increase of 8.3% in 2023. There were increases in 5 of the 7 hotel PIOC components. The insurance component had the highest proportional increase, rising by 27.1%, but accounts for just 7.2% of the index. More moderate increases were seen in labor, 4.2%, taxes, 3.7%, administrative costs, 3.5%, and maintenance, 1.8%. In contrast, fuel declined by 4.1%, and utilities declined by 0.4%. Among the different categories of hotels, the index for traditional hotels increased by 3.9%, rooming houses by 2.5%, and SROs by 3.2%. Since 2007, periodic memos produced by the Rent Guidelines Board staff have analyzed registration data filed with New York State Homes and Community Renewal, or HCR, by owners of buildings containing rent-stabilized hotel units. Prior to 2017, staff relied on the registration information provided by the owner or managing agent to identify hotels and rooming houses. However, a close analysis of the data showed that there were registration errors and many apartment buildings are being erroneously registered as hotels or rooming houses. Since 2017, staff have analyzed the individual records of buildings registered with HCR as either hotels or rooming houses to try to determine if they fit the legal definition of a unit that would be registered under the RGB hotel orders. While not necessarily a complete count of rooming houses and hotels, the methodology that is used to identify hotels is more representative than would be based solely on owner-reported HCR registration status. Using the methodology developed in 2017, the sample frame for the 2022-2023 HCR analysis included 108 hotels and 360 rooming houses, a total of 468 buildings. However, many of these buildings do not register in each year. In 2022-2023, 304 of the 468 buildings in the sample frame were registered with HCR. Because 2023 filings are not a complete count as of the publication of this report, the buildings in the sample frame were also searched for in 2022 data. However, data from 2023 was utilized for the vast majority of these buildings, 84%, while 91% of the data used to compute median and average rent levels was based on 2023 HCR registration filings. Owners of buildings containing rent-stabilized units are required to register annually with HCR with detailed information about the buildings they own and the units within them as of April 1st of each year. Among the information that HCR requests is the unit status, which can be recorded as either rent-stabilized, vacant, permanently exempt, or temporarily exempt. For those units that are registered as exempt, owners can also provide additional information about the reason. In total, 10,675 hotel and rooming house units in 304 buildings were registered in 2022-2023. Of these registered units, almost half, 5,079 or 48%, were registered as rent stabilized. For the 4,356 units that were registered as temporarily exempt, the most common reason cited is hotel/SRO transient. An additional 1,240 units were registered as either vacant or permanently exempt. The HCR registration data can also be used to determine how many buildings, as opposed to units, are being used primarily for permanently rent-stabilized housing. As based solely on HCR registration data for the total of 304 hotels and rooming houses identified for the 2024 hotel report, 63 of these buildings consist entirely of exempt or vacant units and have no rent-stabilized tenants. And 102 of these buildings have a proportion of permanently rent-stabilized tenants of at least 85%. Within the 102 buildings that are at least 85% occupied by rent-stabilized tenants, there are 3,539 units, 3,278 of which are currently registered as rent-stabilized. Note that solely for buildings registered as hotels, staff researches alternate sources of total unit counts. The number of buildings that are at least 85% occupied by permanent rent-stabilized tenants drops when utilizing estimated counts for hotels derived from sources outside of HCR registration data. Based on these estimated unit counts, a total of 79 buildings are at least 85% occupied by rent-stabilized tenants. These 79 buildings contain 3,881 units of housing, 2,826 of which are rent-stabilized. This slide will present a quick explanation of the types of rents that can be registered with HCR. Owners can register up to 3 different types of rents with HCR during the annual registration filing as of April 1st of each year. All rent-stabilized units have a legal rent. Under current law, this is the amount of rent that can be charged to new tenants upon a vacancy or to current tenants who do not have a registered preferential rent. A preferential rent is defined as a rent that owners charge to tenants that is lower than the registered legal rent. Among the reasons owners utilize preferential rents are market conditions at either the start of the tenancy or subsequent rent adjustment periods, or agreements with governmental agencies subsidizing the rent of the unit. Under current law, future rent increases are based on preferential rents until vacancy, at which time the owner may collect up to, but not more than, the legal rent. Actual rents are the rents that are paid out of pocket by subsidized tenants, with the balance being paid by government programs such as Section 8, Shelter Plus, or SCREE. The RGB uses the HCR registration data to calculate a 4th type of rent, rent received. This is an estimate of the rent actually being received by the owner, generally speaking, the legal rent, unless a preferential rent has been recorded. Each of these types of rents provides an important source of information. The legal rent can inform on the maximum amount able to be collected by owners, either currently or upon vacancy. Preferential rents can inform on the prevalence of a less competitive market or regulatory agreements. Actual rents can provide a more accurate representation of rent burden, where low-income tenants may have rents that are subsidized, and the rent received is the best estimate of the revenue owners are currently receiving for each unit. This slide will present the median and average rent levels from 2022-2023 for each of the 4 types of rents we just discussed. Per HCR registrations, the median legal rent for rent-stabilized units is $1,068, and the average rent is $1,130 for both hotels and rooming houses combined, 4,937 units. In total, 913 units, or 18% of the total, also report preferential rents, with a median preferential rent for both hotels and rooming houses combined of $802 and an average preferential rent of $966. In total, 1,559 units, or 32% of the total, also report actual rents, with a median actual rent for both hotels and rooming houses combined of $276 and an average actual rent of $538. And the rent received by owners for the 4,937 rent-stabilized units is a median of $910 for both hotels and rooming houses combined, and an average rent received of $1,011. The HCR registration data from 2022 and 2023 can also be analyzed longitudinally, comparing rent levels in the same set of units in each of the 2 years. Of the 256 hotels and rooming houses identified in the 2023 data, 233 were also registered in 2022. However, not every building contains units with registered rents. Therefore, the longitudinal sample includes 54 hotels containing 2,079 rent-stabilized units and 128 rooming houses containing 2,240 rent-stabilized units, a total of 182 buildings with 4,319 units. The longitudinal data for rent shows that between 2022 and 2023, the median legal rent rose 1.8% overall, and the average rent rose 1.6% overall. The median preferential rent was unchanged overall, and the average preferential rent rose 0.2% overall. Due to a small sample size and some anomalous data, the change in actual rents could not be reported for hotels this year. However, in rooming houses, the median actual rent rose 3.5%, and the average actual rent rose 0.7%. And for the rent received by owners, the median fell 1.2% overall, and the average rent rose 0.9% overall. As can be seen on the previous slide, for some categories of rents, the median and average rents increased over the past year. An examination of individual records in the longitudinal sample shows that some owners increased legal rents, even though rent increases for hotels and rooming houses were not granted by the RGB during this time frame. In total, 63% of units in the longitudinal sample had no rent increase in legal rent, while 6% of units had a rent decrease and 31% had a rent increase. Among the 1,343 units in total that registered a legal rent increase, which was 31% of all units, 58.9% increased rent by either exactly 1.5%, 2.5%, 3.25%, or 5.0%. These increases coincide with 1 and 2 year lease increases granted to rent-stabilized apartments under either Order Number 53 or Order Number 54. Each of these orders overlap with the timeframes in the HCR registration data, which records rents at the static point of April 1st in each year. Thank you, and if you have any questions.
Thank you, Danielle. Questions? Alex?
Thanks, Danielle. The actual rents that people paid out of pocket, there are a lot of missing values. Does that imply that when people are not receiving subsidies, that data is not reported?
You're meant to report it only if the tenant is paying you a subsidized rent and somebody else is covering the rest of the rent. That being said, the HCR data has a lot of errors in it, and sometimes that field is going to be populated with maybe a preferential rent or the legal rent or, the total rent that they're getting, but it's supposed to be just the rent that is the subsidized portion of it for those that are subsidized.
Thank you.
Thank you. Doug?
Just to understand the data on this, Danielle, I think it's the chart on page 8 that has 10,675 total. Is that the universe of hotels and rooming houses that have been registered? I think that,
That was, sorry, let me just get to that.
and then what about unregistered or illegally converted units?
No,
That
so
would be
this,
separate, right?
this data is all from the HCR registrations, mostly from 2023, some of it from 2022. Basically, I have a list, a running list from every year of what's been reported as being registered as either a hotel or a rooming house. If something new enters that list that wasn't on the running list, I look into it to try to figure out if it is actually a hotel or rooming house, and if it is, it goes on the running list. So this is just
What
what.
about, what about the opposite? Because I guess I'm trying to figure out, because it's my sense, and maybe that there are a cohort of hotels that have been not registered and potentially illegally converted. So if a building was on the list 5 years ago and is no longer on the list, do you know that?
I do know that, and I do have in the written text an estimate. Give me 1 second to find it.
Yeah, it's a fine point, but I was just curious if you had a sense of illegal conversions, because I know that certainly happens in some instances.
It is in here somewhere.
I don't want to, if you could just.
I will
follow up.
find it and
That's fine.
put it in a memo, but it's in here somewhere.
Thank you.
But it also, as I noted in the presentation, there's 468 buildings that I have total in the sample frame, and there was 304 in this year's. That's not the units, but that's just the number of buildings.
Thank you. Other questions or comments? Thank you again, Danielle. All right, at this point, if we have no further discussion, do I have a motion to adjourn? Second?
A second.
We are adjourned. Thank you so much.